Hello everyone, we are very happy today to welcome Simone Borghesi. Then Simone, he has a lot of titles, but he's professor in Siena, professor also at in part-time at the European Institute, if I say it properly, and just excuse me 1 second. And he is director of the Florence School of Regulation, oriented on the climate. To make short, Simone is a big expert on environmental economics, and more precisely, he has worked a lot on implementing pollution permits, and more precisely on the EU ETS. But personally, what I really like in the Simone's work is that to tackle a lot of issues on environmental economics is always keen to discover new methods, new approach, such as networks, such as evolutionary economics. And then we are very happy today to welcome Simone. Just everybody knows how it works, the seminar, but just don't hesitate to ask questions on the questions and the reply, and mainly clarification questions for Simone. The talk will last 40 minutes, and after more reflexive questions at the end. And Simone, the virtual floor is yours.
Jean-Philippe, thanks a lot. Thank you for the nice presentation, first of all. And it's a real honor and pleasure to be here. Well, to be with you, let's say, to be here is not such a pleasure to be at home. So I will try to share my screen. Let's see if I do it correctly. You should be able to see it now. All right. Jean-Philippe, do you confirm that you see and hear me correctly?
It's perfect.
Okay. So thank you again for the kind invitation. The paper I'm going to present is joint work with Angelo Antoci, Gianluca Iannucci, and Mauro Sodini from the University of Sassari, Florence, and Pisa, respectively. And it is very much work in progress, so comments are very welcome, but I thought it was representative of the kind of research that we're trying to pursue with my colleagues. The title is Leave or Remain, an evolutionary approach to carbon leakage in emission trading systems. And from the first part of the title, you might think it's about Brexit. Actually, this was done on purpose to attract, let's say, your attention. Brexit had always provoked strong conflicts and strong tensions. But it is not about Brexit. It's the second part that matters. It is about carbon leakage in emission trading systems. So let me give you an overview of my talk today. I will start by giving you the background, the emission trading system features and trends, just to make sure we all are on the same line on the top. And then we'll focus more specifically on carbon leakage in emissions trading systems, discussing the findings of the literature, and so reaching the motivation of the paper. Then I will describe the structure of the model, the main results that we find so far, and the possible future extensions, so the next steps that we see for our research. No, just a second. Okay, so starting with the emission trading system, as you probably know very well, emission trading systems are cap and trade systems in which the regulatory authority initially sets the maximum amount of emissions, so the cap, that is allocated among the polluters. Polluting first, then trade emissions, that's why cap and trade, among themselves, and the meeting between demand and supply leads to a market price for pollution of the natural resource. So allows to apply the so-called polluter pays principle. The market price signals the scarcity of the resource and creates the incentive for polluting firms to innovate, to move their technology towards a clean technology, an environmental friendly one, if they want to avoid paying the cost of purchasing the permits. So emission tradings are therefore a cost-effective instrument. We know that in theory, they allow us to achieve emission reduction targets at minimum cost. However, as I usually say, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they aren't. And this funny sentence applies very well to emission trading as well, because applications in practice have come across difficulties and problems over time. However, the number of applications of emission trading systems is growing, and especially to fight climate change, to reduce greenhouse gases. This image shows the extension of the emission trading system, so the carbon market to fight carbon emissions at the world level. Following the European Union emission trading system, which started in 2005, other jurisdictions have adopted similar systems. For instance, California, Quebec, 10 states on the eastern coast of the US, the so-called regional greenhouse gas initiative, and more recently, Mexico, Kazakhstan, New Zealand, and last but certainly not least, China. China started with 7 pilot projects, and actually at the beginning of this month, formally extended it to a national-wide system. So we have a Chinese emission trading system since February 1. Also, the actual trading is expected to begin around June, so mid this year. These systems have different features, and in order to align and possibly linking them in the future, I'm currently directed a project at the European University Institute named DICET, where the acronym stands for Deepening International Cooperation on Emissions Trading. And the project involves the regulators of the main emission trading systems around, so the European Commission and the governments of California, China, New Zealand, Quebec, and Switzerland. The ultimate goal of this project is to support the European and member state policymakers in deepening international cooperation for the possible integration of carbon markets. So the basic idea is to see whether these systems can be harmonized and possibly linked in the long run, let's say. But today, I don't want to talk about the different emission trading system. I want to discuss some aspects that might derive from these differences. So different ETSs show different features and trends. And this is reflected also in the different price trends. So let me show you, just to give you an idea, the case of Europe first, which is, as I said, the one that started, let me see if I manage, okay. They started first, and this diagram shows the intertemporal evolution of the EU ETS price from the very beginning, 2005, up to today. As you can see, the price had fluctuations, but in general, a sharp decline during the financial crisis when the price went below 5 euros per ton of CO2 and remained there for a long while. And then the price recovered when new reforms were announced by the Commission, which eventually led prices to grow to what is now a new record. Yesterday, the price of the European Union allowances was 38 euros per ton of CO2. And a similar trend emerged also for the other main emission trading system. They all had an initial fall in prices and then a recovery. So they are all on an upward trend right now. And here you see in dark green the case of New Zealand, in light green South Korea, in red Switzerland, which at the beginning of 2020 joined the European Union emission trading system linked to the EU ETS. So prices are converging towards the European one. And California and Quebec, which again joined their two own ETSs. That is why you have only one line, the gray one, that represents a common price there. And if you look at the prices, you obviously see there are differences. The European one, being 38, is more than twice as large as the price in the California-Quebec system right now. But the difference is even larger with respect to China. The Chinese pilot emission trading system have their own fluctuations. But if you look at the general trend, you will notice that the price is between 10 euros and around, let's say, 2 euros. So in a much lower range than the others, and especially than the European one. So while this paper and presentation is not about the differences between the various emission trading systems, these price differences may motivate the research on carbon leakage. Indeed, in the absence of a global carbon market, unilateral carbon policies may have carbon leakage effects. And as you know, by this we mean that they may induce firms to offshore their production, delocalize it, and move towards countries that have laxer or no environmental regulation, and so in our case, lower or no carbon prices. And this risk is particularly severe for some sectors that are particularly vulnerable to this risk because their, let's say, decarbonization technologies are particularly difficult, such as cement, steel, aluminum, chemical, and so on. So to avoid delocalization, carbon leakage, most emission trading systems have decided to adopt carbon leakage provisions in the form of free allocation to the sectors that are considered at risk of carbon leakage. And these sectors are generally those that are more carbon intensive and or trade intensive. The adoption of these provisions have provoked a heated debate among scholars and also among policymakers, let's say in the public opinion, because some of these criteria that have been adopted looked sometimes too generous. For instance, in two interesting papers, Martin and other authors have pointed out that the European Union was too generous at the beginning in choosing these criteria, so that in the end, the free allocation was not very effective or too good, so to speak. This debate and the increasing importance of the ETS have generated a growing literature, both ex ante and ex post, on how the ETS can impact carbon leakage, and so indirectly abatement. And if we look at this literature, there is a strong divergence between the expected results that emerge in the ex ante literature and the observed outcomes that are measured by the ex post literature. The ex ante theoretical studies generally simulate the carbon leakage effects using either general equilibrium approaches that look at the impact at the level of the whole economy, or partial equilibrium approaches that look at the individual sector level. And depending on the methodology that is adopted, studies find different results, so different levels of carbon leakage. In general, CGE models, so computable general equilibrium models, predict lower carbon leakage rates than partial equilibrium models. The former in the range of 0.33%, the others in the range of 0.100%. And the studies mentioned here in blue are some meta-analysis of these ex-ante studies that find these general results. But while ex-ante studies find some evidence, or better, predict some evidence of carbon leakage, the ex-post studies generally find little or no evidence at all. For instance, one quite famous study is the one by De Schelle and others that find no evidence of carbon leakage effect in the ETS for multinational companies over the period 2007-2014. And also other more recent studies, like the one by Ausle Moore or Negle and Zaklan, confirm these results. Some other studies that look more into single country at a single country level actually find some evidence of carbon leakage. For instance, a study by Koch and Bassemama for German firms, or the one that I conducted together with Chiara Franco and Giovanni Marin on Italian firms. We do find some evidence of carbon leakage, so still a weak one, so to speak. So summing up, what the literature finds is, in general, conflicting evidence, but this is normal, so to speak, but little evidence on average of carbon leakage. Having said that, you might think, well, the topic is not so relevant. But on the contrary, there are reasons why I believe carbon leakage is an important topic to be discussed. Indeed, even if carbon leakage, the evidence is little so far, it might emerge in the long run. And this might happen for different reasons. First, the studies up to now have focused on the early phases of the emission trading system. Those phases which I showed you before, having prices very low almost everywhere. So where prices were below 5 euros in the EU ETS during and after the financial crisis. So no wonder that there was little incentive to delocalize. But the situation might change drastically since prices have been increasing afterwards and are still rapidly increasing to record levels, as I was saying, beyond 30 euros right now, but are expected to reach, say, 3-digit prices, so 100 euros or more by the end of this decade. An expectation, let's say, that is quite widespread among market operators, but also institutions. I was reading that in, say, Bank of England, Bloomberg, or Financial Times. On top of this, the carbon price differences that we observed in the graphs before might grow in the future, because single countries and jurisdictions might have different policy stringencies and different ambition levels. So all these reasons make me believe that carbon leakage is an important issue to be studied and might become empirically more and more relevant in the future, in the next few years. For this reason, we try to contribute to this literature, but want to look at it in a new way, let's say, with a different theoretical approach. And the starting point for this are a couple of papers that argue for something new, let's say. For instance, Grab points out that the findings in the emission trading system literature are at odds with classical theory, but consistent with theories of behavior economics. And also a more recent paper by Flankland and others points out the possible existence of myopic behaviors in the ETS. In their case, particularly talking about the EU ETS, which is not surprisingly the ETS that has been studied more because it's the older one. For this reason, to capture behavioral aspects and myopic behaviors, we set an evolutionary game model where the agents have bounded rationality and adopt imitative behaviors. So the goal of the paper is to study the functioning of the emission trading system using this context and study the impact that an emission trading system may have on the incentive to delocalize to offshore production in the presence of two interactive populations of firms that act in a strategic way. In doing so, we built and we try to further extend two previous works that we have developed with this group of colleagues. One on the incentive to eco-innovation, so to clean innovations, when a floor price is introduced in the ETS. And the second on the incentive to cheat, so to be non-compliant with the regulation, taking account of the sanctions that occur in the ETS. But differently from these previous studies, in this case, we want to look at the possibility of delocalization. So we consider two main aspects that were absent before. First, the possibility that the regulator gives free permits to the market operators. And secondly, the existence of different costs at home and abroad. So having said that, let's look at the structure of the model. We assume that there is a population of capital N firms that produce a unique homogeneous good. Each firm has to choose whether to live or remain, going back to our title. So whether to produce in the home country and be subject to the ETS, so strategy H for home, or live and so relocate production to a foreign country where no ETS is in place. We will call this strategy R, a relocation. To avoid buying the allowances, the firms that are subject to the ETS regulation can decide to abate emissions, and we will indicate with Z the abatement level. On the other hand, to avoid the risk of relocation, the regulator can give an amount of permits for free. We will indicate this with small y. Moreover, to prevent allowances from the price of allowances from collapsing, from getting too low, the ETS regulator can set a floor price. So a minimum price, you can think of it as an auction reserve price in the ETS. And this is actually what has been introduced in most emission trading systems, apart from the European one. We will denote with small x the share of firms that decide to relocate their production, x being between 0 and 1. And so with 1 minus x, the complement to 1, the share of firms that, on the contrary, decide to stay, to remain in the countries. And so the home firms. Each of these two different kinds of firms has its own profit function, but the structure is the same. It's made up of revenues minus costs. So let's start with the home firms. Home firms, the revenues is given by the price of the output times the quantity QH that produce the home firms, minus a set of costs, namely variable costs, which are quadratic in the amount that is produced, the fixed cost CS, the abatement cost, which are a function of quadratic in Z in the abatement level, and the cost of purchasing the permits. And the latter is given by the price of the permits times the amount of permits that firms buy. If you focus on the terms between brackets, this is given by the emissions of each firm minus the abatement level minus the number of firms that receives for free. Notice that for the sake of simplicity, we assume a one-to-one relationship between production and emissions, so that QH denotes both the output and the emissions level. The structure of the profit function for the relocating firms is just the same, revenues minus cost. But in this case, the last two terms on the right-hand side are missing because relocating firms do not abate emissions and do not buy allowances. This is actually the reason why they decide to relocate, to save this cost, to avoid abating and to avoid buying permits. We have two markets, the output market and the allowance market, and we assume that they are both perfectly competitive. So the allowance price is market clearing, such that it equals demand and supply. The supply is given by Q bar, is the supply of emissions allowances given by the regulator. And the demand side is the left-hand side, which again is given by the emissions of each firm, net of abatement and free allowances, times the number of domestic firms that buy permits. So 1 minus X times N. The output price is the standard downward sloping linear demand function. So the price is P bar, the market reservation price, minus alpha, which is the slope of the output demand, times the overall amount that is produced, namely the amount produced by each relocating firms times the number of relocating firms, plus the amount produced by home firms times the number of home firms. So it's a weighted average of the output of relocating and home firms, where the weight are the share of each kind of firm. To capture the imitation processes that I was describing as the motivation at the beginning, we assume the so-called replicator dynamics. So the time evolution, the time derivative of the share of relocating firms, X dot, is equal to X times 1 minus X times the payoff differential. So pi R minus pi H. What this very simple equation tells me is that if pi R is larger than pi H, so if producing abroad is more profitable than producing at home, then X dot will be positive, X will increase, and the number of relocating firms will increase, which is totally reasonable in the sense that if it's more profitable to produce abroad, more firms will want to go abroad. If, on the contrary, pi R is below pi H, this is negative, so X decreases, more firms will want to stay at home and the number of relocating firms decreases. Finally, if the two profits are equal, this term is 0, so X dot is obviously 0, and so the number of relocating firms and thus also the number of home firms is constant, remains constant over time. Basically, if firms are indifferent between staying or leaving, the number of relocating and home firms will not change. With this structure in mind, we solve the first order conditions, assuming Kuhn-Tucker conditions to allow for possible border solutions. And so first decide the amount of output, the amount produced, QH and QR. And in the case of home firms, the amount of abatement that maximize their own profits. And what we find is soon very complicated, let's say, equilibrium values. Therefore, yes,
sorry
please.
to interrupt you. There is a question. I don't know if you see it or not. You have several questions now.
Probably not, because
okay, then I'm going to read for you. What is the intuition of multiplying by x times 1 minus x in the evolution equation of x?
Okay, yes, thanks. The reason is that if x, say, x equals 0, then the whole term is 0. So x dot is also equal 0. So this says that in the case in which no one goes abroad, then that is a stationary state. And also the other extreme case, x equals 1, is a stationary state. So it's a situation where there is no revision of the decision. But maybe we can come back on this in a second, because I'm going to show you one of these cases with the extreme solution. Is it okay?
And you have a second question to remember notation, please. I don't know if you see it.
No, because unless I
Okay,
leave...
then just I think to ask if you can remember notation.
If I can remember the notation, yes.
Yes. I don't know if I think Jean-Christophe has asked for to speak, but I don't know if he can. Pepe,
Allowed it.
can you just go back to the next, in the first order condition? I think you wanted something precise. It was just to remember PP, but
yes, sorry, you're right.
I didn't.
No, and it's a good question, because actually that's the PP is not fantastic. The second P should be a small p. It stands for the price of permits. That is why we call it PP. So P is the price of the output, and PP is the price of the permits, of the allowances. Okay.
And it is exogenous? No.
The price of permits is not, because going back,
but
the allowance price is the one that clears the market.
But the market for permits is competitive.
Yes, it's exogenous in the sense that for firms are price takers.
Yes, just.
Okay. Firms are price takers in both markets, yes. Okay, and then if there are further questions, we can come back on them in a second. So, Jean-Philippe, I proceed, okay? So what I wanted to show, and this I hope helps clarifying my first answer, is that we perform numerical simulations and we find two kinds of equilibria: extreme equilibria or inner equilibrium. So let's start with the extreme equilibrium. Consider the phase diagram on the left. The red curve represents the payoff differential. So when the curve is below the horizontal axis, this means that the profits of relocating are lower than the profits of staying at home. So x dot decreases, which means that, as the arrows show, the process goes on until x gets to 0. So no one leaves the country, or no one leaves the ETS. All firms decide to remain. The diagram on the right represents the opposite case, in which the payoff differential curve is above the horizontal axis. So the share of firms that decide to relocate keeps increasing until eventually everybody leaves, so no one remains. The most interesting case is when you have an inner equilibrium. So an equilibrium, so the red curve crosses the horizontal axis, in this case from above, which means that you have convergence towards a unique equilibrium. From the left, you move to the equilibrium point. From the right, you move leftwards. So at the end of the day, you have the coexistence between the two strategies, the home strategy and the relocation strategy. And so in the end, you will have some firms that remain and some firms that leave. What we want to do is to examine what happens when we modify the parameters of the model, particularly the policy parameters, to see how they can affect the decision to leave or remain, and the key variables, decision variables of the model. So let us first look at the case in which the regulator decides to increase emissions, or better, to increase the supply of emissions, so Q bar. In this case, as expected, the price of the permits decreases. This decreases the incentive to abate emissions.
Simone, I'm sorry I interrupt you once again. There is a question of Bashak, who is asking you if the hypothesis of imitative firms is already introduced and how.
It is introduced in the assumption of underlying the replicator equation. Maybe we can go back to this question at the end. But yes, it is in the replicator dynamics that you have the imitation process. Okay.
And there was another point or comment still on the market, on the permits market, that it was a comment of Jean-Christophe Perrault, that the permit price should be in the market clearing equation.
The permit price should be in the market clearing equation.
You are, I think you want to say you have an equation expressing what happens on the market, on the permits market.
Yes, but in that equation, the variables are a function of the price. So
yes, then on the permit price.
Exactly.
Yes, it was a.
Okay.
It was a past equation before. Sorry, I think I create more confusion than.
No, I'm sorry. The problem is I do not want to switch the screen to Zoom because I'm afraid I might make a mess. That is why I'm not reading the questions. Yeah, and thank you,
I think
sure.
it's okay.
Okay. So I was saying, consider this first set of simulations in which I was saying the regulator increases the supply of allowances. So what happens is the permit price decreases, the abatement level consequently decreases, and obviously since the permits are cheaper, the individual demand of permits increases, and also the incentive to leave the country decreases because allowances are now cheaper. It's what we expected, and obviously it's more interesting to read it from the right to the left, to be honest, because in reality what happens is that the regulator tends to decrease the supply of allowances over time. Consider, for instance, the European Union that has now decreases the supply by 2.2% per year. The second set of simulations concern changes in the floor price. Now, it is interesting to notice that changes in the floor price have no effect when the floor price is very low, because if the floor price is below the market clearing price, which is here around 0.3, then the floor price is ineffective. It's inactive and so ineffective. Therefore, it doesn't change any of the variables we are considering: the pollution permit price, abatement, demand of permits, or the share of relocating firms. When the permit price overtakes 0.3, so overtakes the market clearing price, then it becomes the price. And indeed, from that point onwards, the permit price and the floor price go hand in hand. From that moment, so additional increases in the price induce more abatement, a lower demand of permits, and more firms to relocate. And this goes on until the demand of permits gets to zero, which means that if the floor price gets too high, then firms will prefer not to buy permits any longer. And from that moment, then the floor price becomes irrelevant again, if you want. So Z star and X star are again horizontal curves. So the floor price has an impact only for intermediate values, at intermediate values, neither too low nor too high. Then we look at what happens if we change the marginal abatement cost. Now, remember here, it's a bit small, I'm sorry, but theta is the parameter which measures the marginal abatement cost, because the marginal abatement cost is theta times z. So theta, basically a higher theta means that abating is more costly, and lower theta abatement becomes cheaper. For this reason, I think it's more interesting to read the results again from the right to the left. When theta becomes smaller, which implies cheaper abatement technologies, so technologies that improve. And what we find is that if abatement becomes cheaper, then firms abate more, that increases. There is less reason to demand permits, the individual development permits decreases. So this decreases also the price of the allowances and the incentive to delocalize. And this gets to zero. So everybody decides in the end to stay if abating is extremely cheap. So if theta gets very close to zero, everybody wants to abate and there is no reason to leave the country. But results can be even more non-linear. So in this case, I show you what may happen under some parameter values with changes in the free permits, in the amount of free permits. If firms receive more permits for free, then the incentive to relocate abroad to offshore decreases and X decreases. This reduces the supply produced by relocating countries, the red curve, and increases the one by home firms, SH. What happens to the allowance price? We find an inverted U curve because there are two opposite forces at work. On the one hand, receiving more permits for free, a higher Y, induces more firms to stay or to come back home, so to speak, which increases the demand of permits and so increases the price of permits. But on the other hand, if the amount of permits overcomes a given threshold level, then this means that firms receive too many permits, so they are already granted the permits they need to produce, and so the demand of permits decreases, and this second force in the end might prevail and reduce the price of the allowances. The inverted U curve that you find above is Z star reflects the similar inverted U in prices. So a higher abatement when allowance prices increase and lower abatement when allowance price decrease. And a similar inverted curve appears also when we try to make simulations with changes in the output demand. So what you have on the horizontal axis in this case is P bar, so the output market price, the reservation price. So you basically have, as you move to the right, a shift in the demand of the output. And so what happens here is the following. As the demand increases, first we'll have an incentive to produce more and so to ask more for more permits, ceteris paribus. So the demand of permits increases. This makes the allowance price here increase and also abatement increase. But as the pollution price increases, first have an incentive to relocate. And these incentives may end up more than counterbalancing the increase in the individual demand of permits. So in other words, you have on the one hand an increase in the demand of permits of the firms that stay, but on the other hand, you have less firms that stay because you have more firms that relocate. So in the second effect may prevail over the first, the overall demand of permits may decrease, and so the allowance price may eventually decrease. So as you see, and with this I start getting to the conclusion because I see it's 46. We have many different possible results with this general framework, but just to sum up and look into the possible future directions, what we have here is a very simple dynamic evolutionary model that can describe this dual choice, whether I leave or I remain in a population of ETS regulated firms. So differently from previous evolutionary models, we account for free permits, different costs at home and abroad, and firms' abatement decision. And our results, though still preliminary, show that we can have either extreme equilibria, where everybody imitate the others, and so only one strategy prevails, and coexistence equilibrium, where the two strategies prevail, and so a share of firms remain and the other leaves. And this share is affected by how many permits are given for free, among other things. The imitative behaviors that underlie the replicator dynamics may lead to different and sometimes non-linear effects with smooth or steep changes in the dependent variables. Let's say also with rapid changes sometimes, as you saw from some steep curves that I drew before. Now, this is a very general framework, as I said, and a very simple, a toy model, I would say, but I think it can allow to examine a number of other issues and questions in the future. For instance, one thing we are trying to do now is to compute the carbon leakage rate that is associated to a change in each single policy parameters. Secondly, this model is a very basic model with one jurisdiction, ETS jurisdiction, and let's say a non-ETS jurisdiction, which is basically the rest of the world. Now, in reality, as I was discussing at the beginning, there are multiple emission trading systems around. So it's not a two countries model, but should be a number of N countries with ETS and M countries without ETS. That's the situation right now. So we might consider what happens if we have multiple emission trading systems, which have different features in terms of floor price level, number of reallocations, or exemption criteria. And also looking at the rest of the world, so to speak, that we did not distinguish into, we might consider multiple non-ETS jurisdictions with different carbon intensities. So obviously the environmental outcome of what we do will be very different depending on the direction of leakage, or depending on where we relocate, not simply whether we relocate. And finally, one interesting, in my view, extension would be to examine what would happen if the ETS design depends on the pollution dynamics. Because in this model, we just assume that the regulator decides the amount of permits, the supply, and decides the floor price. But these features might depend on how pollution evolves. For instance, if the level of pollution increases, the regulator might be induced to intervene and reduce supply based on the new information, or increase the floor price based on the new information. And this is actually what somehow might happen in reality. For instance, as I said, Europe is reducing the supply of allowances faster and faster, is considering to introduce a floor price, but is also considering to phase out free allowances. So the question here would be what might happen if the regulator simultaneously adjusts the cap rate reduction and phases out free allowances. So simultaneously does more than one change at a time. So these and other questions can probably be addressed, but this is definitely for the future. Many questions and little or no answer in this case. And on this, I think I will stop here to leave room to your questions.
Thank you, Simone. You can see you have some comment and question on the questions and reply.
Okay, now I am back to Zoom.
You see below, you see Q&R and you don't see the...
Yes, just a second, because I see one first in the chat by Corina, maybe. This concerns probably the European Emission Trading System, where she says the graph starts in 2008 phase 2 before the price was almost zero. Well, actually, that is not fully correct, because the price went to zero in phase 1 because there was no banking allowed. So basically, you could not bring the allowances that were left over to the following phases. So everybody wanted to get rid of the allowances at the end of phase 1. That's why the price in phase 1 at the end of phase 1 went down to zero. So yeah, just to answer that point. And now, okay, I think I already answered the first few comments.
You have just the 3 last one. You have 2 comments and 1 question.
So I start from the question by Corina, right? Question for the discussion. Have you thought of making firms heterogeneous with respect to theta? Order them and identify the threshold of theta up to which firms relocate. In your current model, who relocates is random. Thank you, Corina. This is an interesting insight. To be honest, my answer is no. I haven't thought of differentiating firms with respect to theta. So let's say the abatement technology, because in our model is very simple, as you saw. We are just trying to capture some possible trends that might emerge in this process. But this is so we have firms basically the same. But yes, this is a very interesting way of enriching the model and increasing the heterogeneity. And if I may add a reflection that comes to my mind, these kind of models allow for very rich dynamics. Well, in this case, it's not the case, because this is a very simple model as a starting point, probably. But there are possible richer dynamics that sometimes generate also chaotic dynamics. So the richer the degree of heterogeneity, the more likely these dynamics to emerge. There is Bazak. Thank you, Bazak, for the comment. What is the role of fixed costs and their differential for relocating and remaining firms? Okay. We initially started with, let's say, general costs, but then we decided to distinguish between variable and fixed costs, because fixed costs, let's say, are generally higher for firms that relocate. There is a fixed cost to pay in the decision to delocalize production, which makes fixed costs higher. But on the other hand, then producing abroad can be cheaper, especially if you are free from environmental regulations, so to speak. So in our simulations, we use fixed costs for relocating firms that are higher than for home firms. And yes, the outcome will obviously be affected by how large this difference. So basically, fixed costs can capture elements like, learning about this new market, getting in contact with a new bureaucratic system, or also finding new people to work for your firm. Corina says that the scale of the graph doesn't allow for 2005. I may come back to the graph if you want. Just a second. Maybe I uploaded the wrong one. Let me see. How can I see that? Just a second, Corina. I'll be with you. Yes, you're right. Thank you for pointing this out. Yes, it started from phase 2. Thank you. It's correct. And in reality, the system started from 2005. And just to add an information, it started very well in 2005. At the beginning, the European emission trading system started with prices that went very much immediately very high. Then oversupply came and prices fell, as I was describing before. But thank you for pointing out that the graph started in phase 2. Jean-Christophe asked, what is the story behind the replicator? I was thinking that a firm compete with another and there is a winner. Here, what does it will mean? Thank you, Jean-Christophe, for the question. Well, the basic idea of replicator dynamics is that agents, let's say, because you can apply not only to firms, but also to other contexts, tend to imitate the other. They look at myopically at what is the most profitable strategy at the moment. So if they see, in our example, that firms by delocalizing earn more money, they simply mimic them and adapt and decide to change their strategy. If they see that more money are done by staying, they stay or they come back. So basically what this kind of dynamics allow is to consider for myopic behaviors, because when firms decide, they do not consider the future flow of profits. They are myopic in this sense. They imitate the others in this sense. And actually, this is a kind of a modeling that is very much applied in many other contexts to get this kind of bounded rationality, as I was describing at the beginning. Bazak points out, there is no trade in your model. Environmental regulations seem to play a bigger role on trade partners of firms than relocalization. North specializing in clean goods and North specializing in clean goods and the South in dirty goods. Okay, let me just give me a second to think about this question. Well, the first part is certainly, I know the answer in the sense that you're right, there is no trade. And this is a limitation of this first toy model, if you want. And indeed, we are thinking of an extension in which you have both the primary and the secondary market, which is not the case here. It is true in this case, it's more primary market only focus, regulator and firms. The reason is we want to capture this kind of imitative behaviors. We want to stress the bounded rationality aspects or stress some elements of reality. And so start easy, but we are already planning to be honest, the possibility of a secondary market. North specializing in clean goods and the South in dirty goods. I'm not sure now I see what you mean here, but yes, generally speaking, I'm not sure I really grasped the implication, but generally speaking, let's say that could be the case, and carbon leakage is about this. So in a way, because carbon leakage is about firms that are under an ETS, so mainly in developed countries that decide to move to emerging economies. And so carbon leakage is about a dual world in which, if you want, the North manages to reduce emissions by offshoring part of the production. So in a way, this kind of thinking that you were suggesting between the lines is also what we had in mind when we started looking at this topic. Okay, trading output, says Corina. I think trade is interested in my view, it's allowance trade that it would be interested here because the rest is a set of firms that produces for the market. Yes, obviously we can enrich and complicate the model as much as we desire, but we also have a trade-off between our ability to reach analytical results and get insights and the complexity of the model. So probably for trade, a north-south trade, we would probably need a different framework. But thank you for the comment, because I will reflect on this as well. Yes, I see the last comment now by Bazaka. I'm scrolling down the screen, and Bazaka is saying differences in environmental regulations between north and south. That's what you were meaning. And yes, if you want, this is exactly what I was meaning when I said it would be, we would like to extend the model to multiple countries, multiple ETS and multiple non-ETS, because at the moment we have just one ETS and a non-ETS world. So if you want, we have a north-south structure in your suggestion, but also within the south there are different aspects, or within the north there are different levels. So that is why I think we should take into account of the differences in the regulation. When you talk about in your comment differences in environmental regulation, that's what I meant by saying having multiple countries, because every country has its own regulation level. And in terms of carbon prices, this means we have high carbon prices, middle carbon prices, low carbon prices, or even zero carbon prices for a large number of southern countries. So again, this is something that a direction we'd like to explore in the future as well. So thanks a lot for this comment. Jean-Philippe, I think I talked too much, because
no, not at all.
We went beyond the time in the end.
But I think there is another question of Corina, but we can also even send you the question. I had just one small, but you can see the question of Corina in the same time. But I have just a small question. It's not a limit of, I will rephrase differently. We know that the sectors which are covered by EU ETS, you have talked about cement, steel, iron, they are oligopolistic sectors. And then we have firms which are price makers on the market for products. Here, I think it's impossible to, since you have a bounded rationality, you have this mimetic phenomenon. Do you know in the literature if it's possible to mix at the same time strategic behavior and this mimetic behaviors? And if you could, perhaps you could go even further in the analysis of the market. It's an open question. I'm sorry.
No, it's an open question. It's a very good question. It's something that with my colleagues we are trying to address, because you are perfectly right. Most of the sectors that receive permits for free are not competitive, are oligopolistic. So this is an issue. I mean, we went for the simplest possible situation to get some results that we may comment on, and policy indications, which is something we like to share with the regulators. But it is possible, I think, to account for oligopolistic markets and still have replicator dynamics. Let's say we need to sit down, I think, a bit more on this to get with a proper answer on this. But yes, obviously, again, a trade-off in terms of analytical simplicity and policy insights. But since I read Corinna's question, and I thank you, Corinna, for your nice comments. Yes, we don't need to get analytical results for these dynamics. Let's say, we tend to look for analytical results because this look more robust rather than having only simulative results. But I think the simulation results are very telling. We do not aim at having a calibration model, really calibrating the real world parameters, but I think that we get some insights that generally do not appear in the traditional, with the traditional modeling. So in this sense, yes, it's reassuring, and I thank you, Corinna, that you think it this way. Yes.
And just after, perhaps the last question, and after we are going to stop to bother you and so on. But I have, perhaps it could be nice to try to replicate a bit the result of Martin in the. You were speaking of the paper of Martin, Muge, Wagner, and Depreux, and perhaps you could also do a bit the same with your model to try to determine the optimal allocation, because in a sense, with your replication mechanism, you have a kind of relocation risk as in their paper, and you could try, as in their paper, to determine the optimal level of free allocation, and then you would have the probability of relocation, and perhaps it could be a different approach to look a bit at the same thing as what they do in their paper, and to discuss if free allocation was well designed or not. Of course not, but otherwise there is no paper. But
I agree on that one. But in general, yes, that's a very good point. In a way, I think that the inverted U curve that I showed you before captures already the existence of an optimal free allocation. Because if you go beyond the value that corresponds to the vertex of the curve, you went too far, you were too generous, and abatement level starts decreasing. So you don't get the target you wanted to reach at the beginning. So somehow this optimal free allocation with the probability of relocation is implicit in this in our simple model. But yes, it's good, the idea of making it emerge more clearly, even because yes, I mean, this is the result of a simulation, and again, we have to double check how robust it can be to perturbing the model with further changes in the parameters. But the fact there is an inverted U curve means that, again, there is an optimal allocation, maximum amount of allowances you should keep.
perhaps we are going to conclude and to applaud you, to thank you very much. You have other comments congratulating you, and
thanks a lot.
It was really a pleasure to have you, and
my pleasure. It was great to take part in it. So I'd rather be together with you. And
don't hesitate to come back. You are more than welcome, and so on.
When I have new results, I will be glad to come back.
See you soon, and thank you to everyone to have attended to this seminar.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Simone. And I will send you all the questions and the comments that you will have during this seminar.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Frederick.
Have a nice
You too.
evening.
I
Bye-bye.
hope we will meet one day in conferences. We'll meet again.
I look forward. I look forward. Ciao.
See you soon. Thank you.